Hello and welcome to another episode of the Strength Syndicate podcast with myself, Shane Story, and my co-host Lawrence King. So today on the podcast, we are joined by the guys from Data Driven Strength. So we have Zac and Josh on today. So we're going to be touching on overload and progression methods for strength training or for powerlifting. So lads, very welcome to the podcast, coming all the way from Florida. So there's going to be people who don't know who you are, naturally enough. Could you tell the people at home who you are, what you're doing at the moment, and your background? We'll go in alphabetical order.
Alphabetical, Josh.
On, Josh.
Oh man, we always fight over who has to do this. Yeah, man, a little bit of our background. So Zac and I met when we were doing our undergraduate degrees at Ohio State University. We kind of got involved with some more clinical-based research at that stage. And then we got hooked up to come down to Florida Atlantic University to pursue our graduate education. Zac wrapped up his master's degree. I guess it's been a little bit now, and I'm wrapping up my master's degree right now. Zac's a PhD student, and we're lucky enough to be research assistants in the muscle physiology lab here at Florida Atlantic University. And then, yeah, man, the rest of our time is occupied by data-driven strength stuff, where I think we originally were just kind of interested in strength training and hypertrophy training in general. And then over the last couple of years, we've kind of identified more and more as powerlifting coaches, because it turns out that people that are nerdy about strength training typically are nerdy about powerlifting. So we've just kind of identified as that more and more over the last couple of years. Work primarily with powerlifters, but also, a good amount of general strength trainees or general barbell enthusiasts, if you will. Yeah, man, other than that, that's kind of the 30,000 foot overview.
Ditto.
So yeah, obviously you are going to be well adept at being able to handle this conversation with us today. So to start off, right, I think it's going to be important that if we're talking about strength, we're talking about overload and progression, should we start off with how do we become strong? Like what are the adaptations that we need that are going to encompass strength?
Maybe before we jump into a lot of the mechanisms underpinning that, what I kind of had a thought maybe was, how would we define overload or progression? I suppose if someone goes back to the first couple of things they were told about the principles of training, an overload or progression is one of them. So maybe can we start maybe with a definition there, maybe, or something?
Yeah, I think the probably the definition most people kind of think of is essentially adding something to the training program. So like, you do 3 sets of 10 with a given weight on session 1, either adding load, reps, sets, potentially increasing the density of the work. All of those are options in which you could progress training. But I think the principle of overload, I think, has probably been best, I guess adapted is probably the right word, but I think Brian Miner was the first one I saw that wrote about it, where essentially Brian talks about how adding something isn't necessarily, that's not the stimulus within and of itself. It's you essentially perform training that's challenging enough or appropriate enough to create an adaptation. And then in order to continue to make the training stimulative, you essentially have to add something to keep it within that challenging range. So I think that's, I don't know how I have like a succinct sentence to summarize that, but I think that's the way that I think about the overload principle is essentially you are adapting to stimulative training. And in order to keep the training continuously stimulative, you need to add something to make sure it's still in that range. Josh, I don't know if you have anything to add there.
I suppose I definitely agree with that. And I suppose by adding something, I think kind of a more maybe antiquated view of it would be that you solely need to add intensity or throw a bucket of volume in the top of something. But I suppose, like you were saying now, from a more, I don't know, we'll say enlightened, but we know now that kind of movement quality, and I suppose one thing you lads speak a lot about that I think people kind of lose sight of is velocity as well. That's something we'd like to maybe chat to you about in a wee bit. But I suppose maybe Shane, going back to your original question then, kind of could you talk us through maybe some progression schemes that you'd use commonly with your own clients?
So this is probably a good time to talk about like day-to-day, like what influences day-to-day performance, because that's going to influence kind of from a higher level, what progression schemes you actually put, in the individual's training program for them to execute, right? So this kind of gets to the general concept of autoregulation, like what exactly that is, right? So like you can, broadly speaking, you can have fixed progression schemes and you can have autoregulated progression schemes. Now, they're definitely not mutually exclusive, but for the purposes of explanation, it's kind of helpful to dichotomize them, right? So like a fixed progression scheme, you would have something like, I add 2.5 kilos to the bar for my given set and rep scheme throughout a training block. Totally fine way to go about it, but that's going to have downsides compared to an autoregulated approach. What an autoregulated approach does is it basically tries to match the training stress to kind of reflect the performance of a given day, right? So in other words, you're trying to kind of keep the relative training stress constant and adjust the actual input, whether that's load, whether that's the number of sets, whether that's the number of reps per set, or a combination thereof, in order to meet the desired training stimulus, right? So then you have to ask the question of, okay, what actually goes into performance on a given day? And the way I like to think of this is kind of like an additive equation, right? So you kind of have like your baseline capacity, right? This is kind of like your general strength going into a training program. Then you have to layer onto that the fitness of a given training program that you've kind of accrued throughout the week. So let's say you're in week 4 of a training block, you've accrued some fitness, and fitness is just generally speaking the positive adaptations that occur as a result of the training program, right? Those are going to go up relatively slow, but they're not going to decay very quickly, right? So they generally stick around, at least, on the time scale of weeks. Then you also have to add in their fatigue, and fatigue is going to decay quicker than fitness, but it is going to kind of, pull down your performance for that day, right? So fitness is kind of adding to your performance and fatigue is kind of pulling away. And then you have to add in another variable on there called readiness. And that's basically like, non-training factors that are going to kind of modulate your performance for that given day. So I like to think of fitness and fatigue as training related, and then readiness as non-training related. Okay. So what autoregulation allows you to do is for your rate of progression to match your performance for that given day, right? And that performance on that given day will be a result of your progress from the given training program, as well as your readiness on that given day, right? The typical example here is your girlfriend breaks up with you 2 hours before your training session, then you have to go in, your readiness is going to be down, and thus your performance is going to be down, right? And you're not going to be able to handle the same training stress. But likewise, I think it's really important to emphasize that autoregulation allows you to push harder when you're feeling good and when you're making good progress, which I think a lot of people overlook, because we often think of autoregulation as kind of holding you back to make sure you're managing fatigue and to make sure that you're not kind of digging yourself into like a fatigue grave, if you will. But really, I think some of the research, which we can get into if you guys want to, on autoregulated progression schemes, is that autoregulated progression schemes allow you to push harder when you're feeling good. And I think that's really what's driving the positive benefits we see from those progression schemes in the research. So that was a bit of a monologue. I don't know if you guys want to ask follow-ups, or if Zach, you want to add something quick.
Yeah, I got one thing just to kind of separate two things that I think are easily mistaken for one another. So Josh just went on a little bit of a discussion on autoregulation. So I think putting this in like kind of a practical example is a little bit easier to conceptualize what I'm saying. But let's say you have a given training protocol, right? And let's use RP so we can be autoregulative with the progression of that protocol, right? So let's say we're just doing 3 sets of 5 at a 7 RP. If I do that week after week, that exact same training protocol, I would consider that progression. So you would be able to manipulate the load as you adapt to that training protocol, but that training protocol is not actually changing. When we're talking about progression schemes, what I would consider that to be is you're actually manipulating the protocol in order to lead to a desired result. So that's going to encapsulate 2 things. That's intentional manipulation of the protocol, but then also still having that fluctuation and progression based on having an autoregulative system in the first place. So I think those are 2 things to keep in mind when we're talking about this, is that you can have progression within the exact same protocol. When we're talking progression scheme, you can do that in a variety of ways as well. Maybe we go, instead of 3 sets of 5 at a 7 RPE all the way, maybe week 1 sets of 5 at a 6 RPE, sets of 5 at a 7 RPE, sets of 5 at an 8 RPE, and within each one of those, there's still autoregulative fluctuations in performance that could be considered progression, but we're also having this progression scheme that is directly manipulated by the actual protocols in our programming. So I think that's kind of important to kind of frame this discussion as far as which one of those two we want to talk about.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. And I suppose in a lot of the programming that I found to be fairly effective, and like you said, that pre-planning of the progression scheme or the autoregulation scheme, where we're starting off at a lower RP, and the RP it's kind of pendulum wave loading, I suppose, of the RP, where it's pre-planned. I think those can be pretty effective. But for you guys with clients from data-driven strength, what are the kind of strategies that you found most effective, or the most effective protocols?
So I think from like a higher level, which kind of informs this, is we really like to lean into peak intensity for our training protocols. And just to quickly define peak intensity, and actually, you know what, I'm going to call it peak load, because I think intensity is a bad word.
I was just gonna
say. Yeah, I saw Zach turn his mute button off, so I was just going to jump in and do it anyway. So just traditionally, intensity is percentage of 1 rep max. Go ahead.
Just before you go on there, can you kind of maybe, I suppose for me, I'd agree on the idea of peak load, or the idea of load versus using the word intensity. Can you kind of talk people why you might prefer the word intensity rather than the use of load?
Yeah, so traditionally intensity is defined as percentage of 1 rep max. But I think that gets conflated with like either proximity to failure or effort, which are two things that also get kind of conflated, right? So we actually have been trying to be good about using 3 separate terms: effort, proximity to failure, and loading, right? So let's just kind of throw intensity out. Load is going to be percentage of 1 rep max. Proximity to failure is objectively number of repetitions shy of true momentary failure. And then effort is going to be basically something we want high all the time. We want to basically always be producing maximal force into the barbell within reason, and obviously don't do that on like something like a leg extension. But those 3 things, you know, if you say intensity, that's going to mean something different to a bunch of different people. But anyway, getting back to my main point, we really like to prioritize peak loading. So what that means is, okay, let's take a given training week. What is the peak percentage of 1 rep max that individual is going to touch? While we might generally use like lower average loads, you know, farther out from a competition or a testing day, we like to keep peak load relatively high throughout the training year. It might go down a little bit, but relatively high throughout the training year for most individuals. We haven't found a lot of success trying to like transition somebody from doing a block of only 8s and then try to get them to be good at hitting singles 3 weeks into the next block. Just doesn't really go well. So we like to keep that skill in basically year round. But luckily, what we can do when we have those top set exposures basically year round is we can produce an estimated 1RM as a result of that, right? And it's going to be relatively accurate. And even if it isn't perfectly relatively accurate, right? It's going to be at least consistent in the sense of, you know, if your estimated 1RM is generally inflated, it's going to be that way across the weeks. But anyway, what it can do is you can produce an estimated 1RM and take a percentage of that estimated 1RM to prescribe back off load. So a protocol we like to do is like a top set followed by a percentage of your estimated 1 rep max, and take that load until you hit a given RPE. So what this allows for is controlling proximity to failure and controlling the load relative to your capacity on that given day. And then you can start to get into like week to week progressions of that. But that is like, you know, if we were to just zone in on a single day, that's a protocol we like to use. And if you were to repeat that week over week, as you get stronger, that estimated 1RM is going to go up, back off loads are going to go up. You might get an extra rep or 2 on those back off sets with an RP cap. but you can also start layering on those, actual changes to the protocol as Zac described, whether that's increasing the back off percentage, increasing the peak loading, et cetera. So that's a protocol we like to use all the time, but that's one very small example.
Just for someone that was listening at home, if we were to throw out numbers at them, I suppose the average squat of our listenership for most of our men would be somewhere around 200 kilos. So if you were a guy with an estimated 1RM of 200 kilos, what might your typical day look like? I know you guys have kind of been big in the prescription of kind of lower RP for the, like you said earlier, keeping in the scale of the specificity of singles, and then kind of prescribing heavier RP than kind of back off work. So could you kind of talk what a squat session might look like, I suppose, for someone that just is listening to that and they're trying to abstract kind of what that means to them?
Sure. Yeah, I can touch on that a little bit. So I don't want to, going back to the terminology, we've been trying to be really, really specific about it. One thing you just said that I'm going to slightly rephrase is you said low RP. Now, often the stuff that we advocate for does result in lower RPs, but specifically the concept we generally try to talk about for training for strength is trying to minimize intraset fatigue. So basically, if you think about it, the way that we like to frame it is powerlifting is about performing one repetition with maximal concentric effort. And it's really, really slow because it's as heavy as you possibly can lift. And so there's two slightly different reasons a repetition could be slow. One, because the weight is very, very heavy, or one, because you've done a ton of reps and you're really tired. We generally prefer the former for powerlifting as it's generally more specific. You're producing more force. So when we're talking about low RP training for strength, really what we want to do is, okay, the vast majority of your training for powerlifting should be with high loads. And that's going to necessitate a high baseline RP, or the lowest possible RP you could achieve with a given load. But once you're kind of doing that top set and maybe you back off to a given percentage of that estimated 1RM, then the question becomes, okay, at that specific given weight, how can we organize the back off sets to best promote high load training across the weeks, across the month, across the year? That's the way that we think about it. So a typical squat session for a 200 kg squatter, maybe they'll come in, work up to that top set, like Josh said, somewhere between 1 to 3 reps, anywhere from a 6 to 9 RPE. That's going to be anywhere between 85 to 95% of their actual 1RM on the day. They do that. That's their strength skill practice. If there's somebody that needs a little bit more of that, maybe their back off work will be a little bit higher percentage of that estimated 1RM. So somewhere between 80 to 90 maybe. But if they're, a more typical person, I would say that needs more of that moderate loading range to get some volume in, still get a little bit of an additional practice with a semi heavy load, more around the 70 to 85% of 1RM range. And then that's where we say, okay, once I've picked the weight that I can tolerate that I'm going to use for my back offs, let's just say 80%. First thing to note, that's still a relatively heavy load. So we're not saying do low RP training with 50% of your 1RM. We still want those loads to be relatively high because that seems to be the factor that's the most predictive of strength gains, the load. Then we want to pick, a given amount of training volume to perform. Let's just say 12 repetitions at that load. Then the question becomes, okay, should we organize that in a way that's, let's say, relatively high, a moderate to high RP, so maybe 2 sets of 6 with 80%. That's somewhere probably around 2 reps in reserve. Or should we manipulate the set structure to have a little bit less intraset fatigue, which results in lower RPEs for that weight? And based on the research we have, 2 pretty good meta-analyses by Jukic and Davies would suggest that essentially, regardless of the set structure, load is the factor that seems to predict strength gains rather than the intraset fatigue or the proximity to failure. So in our mind, when we kind of remove ourselves out of the situation of a study in which every single factor is controlled, we would favor the situation when let's manipulate the set structure to be a little bit higher on the set count, a little bit lower on the rep count, a little bit less intraset fatigue, probably going to have a little bit less fatigue resulting from that workout, which again, if we think about not just the workout, but the long term, the week, the month, the year, what's going to allow us to lift the heaviest loads, which is ultimately the maximizing the principle of specificity. It's probably sparing the fatigue on the back off volume that seems to result in the same strength gains, regardless of the way that you organize it specific to that load. So again, maybe top set 1 to 3 reps, 6 to 9 RP, back that weight off somewhere in the 70 to 85% of the estimated 1RM range, and then probably performing a couple sets of 1 to 4 repetitions, depending on the load. Heavier load you go, you probably perform sets of fewer repetitions. Lighter you go, maybe get a little bit higher rep sets, and then you just manipulate the set count based on however many total repetitions you want to achieve for the individual. And then maybe you do some hypertrophy work after that. We can touch on that, but that's kind of the overarching principle that we've talked a decent amount about, of kind of minimizing intercept fatigue and the back off work for strength. And again, that's just to support the high load training. That is the foundation of the principle. We have some really interesting research on daily max training, the minimum effective dose by one of our good friends, Androlakis Korakakis, aka Pack. I think I nailed that actually. And he's done some really interesting research, kind of comparing a more typical periodized scheme versus a group that's essentially only doing heavy singles, seeing some really good results. And then more recently, his thesis or his dissertation compared a group just doing daily max to a group doing a daily max with some back off sets as well. And all of that, to me, somewhat suggests that those high load sets are really creating the foundation of the program. And then those back off sets are probably touching on most of the other adaptations we're concerned with: hypertrophy, a little bit extra skill practice, all those other things that we want to consider to round out the strength program. But that's kind of the intraset fatigue discussion, I guess. I don't know, Josh, I don't know if I missed anything or goofed up anything.
No, I think definitely the minimizing the intraset fatigue is really important to kind of maximize. And I suppose an adaptation that kind of seems to be lost in powerlifting a lot, like where we talk a lot about hypertrophy or the need maybe for building muscle, but within if we do look at it at a neuromuscular level, maximizing the concentric velocity of the movement is ultimately where we get, like you said, that intent on the concentric is where we do see a lot of the adaptations, along with, like you said, load, or they always say intensity for the unenlightened. Shane, do you have anything you kind of want to jump in there on?
I was just going to say it's also just much easier to practice the scale, like with that maximal intent, if you do have those low rep sets, because yeah, typically if you're doing like a competition squat or bench or deadlift and you're doing a high rep set, like even 6+, like yeah, you can see a good deal of form breakdown just from getting fatigued towards the end of that set. Whereas if you did use the higher set structure with the low reps, maybe able to keep your form a bit more intact and just move every single rep with intent, using your good brace and good positioning. So yeah, I think it's a fantastic idea. We do have that, and that's pretty much implemented in my program at the moment that I'm running from my club. I think on Tuesday we do have a 6x3 instead of a 3x6 now, so that's going quite
well. One thing I do want to say on that, and Josh, actually, I'm going to pitch it to you for some discussion on the pacing research after this. But the first thing I was going to say is I definitely don't want to dichotomize the intraset fatigue stuff to say there's never utility for high intraset fatigue, because I definitely don't think that's the case. The first thing that's obvious is I think on average, higher intraset fatigues are probably more efficient for hypertrophy. I think, going back to the set structure meta-analyses, so long as the load is heavy enough, probably upwards of like 75% of 1RM, that's like a 10RM or heavier, the set structure doesn't necessarily seem to matter for hypertrophy. So that's another kind of benefit to for strength. If you're using moderate to heavy loads, doesn't really seem to matter if we kind of manipulate the set structure to minimize intraset fatigue. Hypertrophy still seems to be pretty good, but that is going to require more sets, which to some people, although I have experimented this with myself, doing 30 back off singles at like 75% of 1RM, and I took 30 seconds between each of those singles. It can be done in the normal time period because I've tried it. It's just, it's a little bit mentally exhausting having to stay completely mentally engaged for like legitimately 20 minutes straight. Not the most fun style of training. So I think on average, higher intraset fatigues or training a little bit closer to failure for hypertrophy probably makes a little bit more sense, probably a little bit more efficient. The other thing is specifically for strength, us setting things up in that kind of top set, back off set approach definitely doesn't mean that's the only way to do it. And for some people, they may not prefer doing it that way, or maybe simply have a greater individual response of doing something other than that. So a common example, we'll give occasionally, especially on like secondary sessions, I find, is doing kind of an ascending volume model where you're going, set of 5 at a 7 RP, set of 5 at 8 RP, set of 5 at 9 RP. So those are higher intraset fatigue sets. But one benefit of those, in absence of top sets, in which those are the very, very specific sets that are, 90% plus of 1RM, in which form breakdown and all those things, shifting of the loading demands, very slow absolute velocities, all those are happening because of load. Now, we think that's the most specific and probably the most efficient way to practice. But if you take those away, let's say we're just performing a set at a flat repetition range, probably do want to have some high intraset fatigue, because that's still going to give you some practice at shifting of the loading demands, knowing what a slow rep feels like, all those other things that are important to consider. So I just don't want ever to be super dichotomous in saying that top set backoffs and low intraset fatigue is the only way for training for strength, because I don't believe that, nor do we do that in our own programming. So that's important to consider. And one other thing I just remembered is that another reason to probably bias higher intraset fatigues on average for hypertrophy, so if you're like doing like an off season or farther away from competition, is we still really don't have good research on regional hypertrophy and then synergistic hypertrophy. Meaning, if I'm looking at a bench press study, on average they're just going to measure the pecs, and we can say relatively confidently that if you're using 80% of 1RM, 2 sets of 6 versus 6 sets of 2, doesn't really seem to matter for pec hypertrophy. But we really don't know what's going on in the triceps and different regions of the pec. We only have a few studies on that. So I think, as kind of a fool safe, when you're performing training farther from the competition and you're trying to really maximize hypertrophy, probably not a bad idea to train a little bit closer to failure with higher intraset fatigue. But the last thing I want to hit on, what Shane said, was with high rep sets and really focusing on concentric intent and really trying to maximize velocity with a given load. I am totally on the same page with you that higher rep sets seem to be more challenging to do that. I was recently doing a session, I was training with Josh actually, and I was doing like sets of 7. And I was really focusing on maximal concentric intent, like very much focusing on that. And I slightly changed something mentally on the second set, or maybe I had a spotter actually, I think is what it was. And my velocity loss like dipped in half, even though it was like my 4th set. So like little factors like that can really impact your ability to do that. And then this is where I was going to kick it to Josh to talk about some of the pacing research, because I think there's a little bit of evidence to kind of support that with higher rep sets.
Yeah. In terms of the pacing research, I'll be very, very brief here, in part because it's been a few months since I've looked closely at this stuff, but I would refer the interested listener to an article I wrote for our website. I titled it, "How Hard Are We Training? Additional Considerations for RAR Accuracy." So I have a section in there called, modulation of effort. And I'm just going to kind of point out like one interesting tidbit from the series of studies by Halperin and colleagues. And like Zach said, they're kind of looking at this phenomenon called pacing, right? It's fairly common in like the endurance literature. Haven't dug into that super closely, but I'm fairly confident there's robust amount of literature on like, subconscious pacing strategies with, a given endurance bout. But again, kind of that tidbit I wanted to point out is that at the beginning, at like right when they get to the lab, they do a maximal force output of 1 rep. I think they did bicep curls in these studies. It's like an isometric bicep curl. So you kind of have your arm at 90 degrees. You're just told to push as hard as you can, right? And then the researchers get a force output in newtons. So they did like 1 rep of that as hard as they could to kind of anchor performance for the day. And then they went on to these different protocols, right? They were either, kind of tricked into thinking they only had to do 5 maximal concentric or maximal isometric contractions. And then they like actually had to do 5 more. So again, check out that article for more on that. But the interesting tidbit is that no matter which kind of group they were in, once they actually started the actual study after that, anchoring of their max force output for the day, they were typically lower by about 7.5% of their max force output on the first rep after like plenty of rest. Like there's absolutely no reason that their force output should have been 7.5% lower on the first rep of whatever condition they were in. Right. So the point is like, we kind of, whether it's subconsciously or slightly consciously, we hold back a little bit. And Zach's anecdote there about his velocity output on sets of 7 on squat is, really important to drill home, is like, I think there's a lot more that goes into that beyond just like, all right, got to move this as fast as we can. I think, and it's also important to point out, like, they were very clear in the manuscript of these papers that they were given strong verbal encouragement during all those. So just imagine a team of researchers yelling at you and you're still like producing submaximal force, even though you're told and yelled at to do it as hard as you can. So anyway, that's kind of the general pacing research. And I think, again, when we start to get into, okay, how can we manipulate training in order to maximize, our effort and to maximize the quality of our training, then you can start to get into these alternative set structures.
That's something that I would have noticed as well when I would have been personal training clients. It's like, if you tell somebody that they have 4 sets to do, the first few sets they'll kind of sandbag it until they get to the 4th one. But if you don't tell them how many sets they're going to do, they're probably going to give it socks on like the first set, and then you tell them we have 3 more sets to do, and then they're like, oh, fuck's sake, shouldn't have went so hard.
One thing I'm kind of curious about, and I suppose it's kind of, or I'm kind of maybe dragging us back here again, but look, that's what we're here for. We've kind of spoken a little bit about the main work, but I suppose where this is kind of, we're kind of interested as well, I suppose, in not just strength, but I suppose hypertrophy as well. How is this kind of progression scheme different then than maybe accessories or kind of the, I suppose, the disco muscles movements?
Yeah, I think the one thing I want to hit on, and I'll actually pitch this one to Josh because I was talking for a while on this last one. One thing I think is important, we're talking kind of the progression system, Josh. I don't know if you want to touch on like how generally we view periodization for strength, probably. I think that's probably a good place to go, just based on kind of talking about progression. And we talked on the low fatigue stuff. Then I also brought us back as like, oh, we don't do it all the time. If you want to like put a nice bow on that and kind of talk about that, I think it'd probably be a good place to go.
Yeah. So I'll talk about our thought process for periodization for strength, and then I'll finish it up and kind of touch on the accessory stuff to actually answer the question in terms of what a progression scheme might look for that. So we kind of like to think of periodization on like a training cycle level. So I think the community, and we would definitely agree with this, has moved away from like really long-term planning of like, all right, we're 6 months out, we're doing sled pushes and mile runs, and then we'll get to the barbell 3 months out type of thing. That's an over exaggeration, but you get the idea of training is going to be pretty specific year round. And we kind of think of periodization, within a training cycle. So let's call it 12 weeks. That might vary a little bit, but let's call it 12 weeks. That'll be broken up into like 2 or 3 training blocks. But for this example, just to make it simple, let's say we have 2 training blocks that are each 6 weeks long. Earlier in the cycle, right? So that first training block will kind of bias hypertrophy outcomes. Again, like I said before earlier in the podcast, still going to be plenty of heavy loads. It's not going to be a totally different training program. But again, we're kind of hedging our bets a little bit more towards, hypertrophy outcomes. And if that's at the sacrifice of, top end strength performance by a little bit, we're okay with that, right? That's a bet. That's a sacrifice we're willing to make. But then once we get later in the training cycle, we'll kind of flip the switch and focus and really prioritize those top sets a little bit more. That peak loading will probably increase a little bit more, really make sure you're ready for the end of the cycle. If you have, a meet planned, or if you're going to be testing in the gym, or you just, want to hit a nice single at 9 or 9.5 to finish out the cycle type of thing. And then next we layer on, okay, like what training variables change? Again, in general, there's not going to be dramatic changes in peak loading. Average loading, also probably not going to be dramatic changes. Those things might go up a little bit, but nothing crazy. Training volume, that's something we also keep relatively consistent. That might be a little bit of surprise for the listener, but we've put out a little bit of stuff on this, but generally speaking, we think that if you focus on manipulating interset fatigue throughout that training cycle, and that being the primary variable that changes from a hypertrophy phase to a strength phase, you can kind of get the best of both worlds, if you will, right? You can basically maintain the training volume, but get some of the fatigue reduction effects that you would get from reducing the training volume in that strength phase. So in a hypertrophy phase, honestly, we're not really going to touch below like RP6 or RP7 much, if at all. Maybe in like the first week when you're introducing the training, okay, we might do like a top set of RP6 or RP5 or something, but really that's it, right? Like we're going to be pushing RP 8, 9, maybe even 10 for a lot of work, which I think might come to us as a surprise for someone that's like, oh, they advocate for like sometimes doing doubles at 80% instead of, sets of 6 at 80%. It's like, most of the time we're pushing pretty high RPs, right? So in that hypertrophy phase, pushing higher RPEs and higher interset fatigue. So let's say, for a given protocol in a hypertrophy phase, we're doing like sets of 7 with 75% or so, right? Taking those to like, let's say that's like an RP8 for that given individual. Then when we go to the strength phase, we take that same exact slot and we'll just kind of like slightly bump up the load, but decrease the number of reps per set. Okay, we're getting a little bit more specific, a little bit more loading, but we're reducing the reps per set, and that's going to decrease the intraset fatigue. We're probably going to increase the number of total sets that's completed in that strength phase, right? But each set in and of itself isn't super difficult or isn't super fatiguing, I should say, or a ton of training volume. So it's not like our volume's actually going up. We're trying to keep it about the same. And what we see as a result of that is we're able to tolerate slightly higher loads. Our confidence level that the hypertrophy stimulus is maximized is a little bit lower, but we're confident it's still close to maximal. And what we've just noticed in practice, and I think there's an interpretation of the research that would lead you to believe that you're going to be a little bit fresher going into your next top set exposure for that lift, and thus being able to touch heavier and heavier loads and kind of get that fatigue reduction effect as a result of lower intraset fatigue, as opposed to lower volume in a more traditional model. Okay. So that's kind of the high level periodization for strength. And then to get to accessories specifically, man, we're really pushing those hard in the hypertrophy phase, really, really hard. Like we're on our clients, like weight on rice, and like making sure that those, belt squats are to a true RP9. And because I think we see that all the time, that something that's logged as an RP9 might actually be like 6-7 reps in the tank, especially if it's at the tail end of a workout, if they're not as invested in it. Really focus on exercise selection, exercise execution, and RP accuracy for those, right? Then in a strength phase, we will pull back the RP of those, increase the load of those, and again, potentially increase the number of sets. So maybe you're doing belt squat for, sets of 8 to 10 at an RP9 in the hypertrophy phase. Maybe you go belt squats for like sets of 6 to 7 at like an RP 6 to 7 in the strength phase. And again, similar to that concept I talked about with like a main lift slot, you're able to kind of reduce the intraset fatigue, probably reduce the fatigue that's going to carry over for your next exposure to that lift, and ultimately touch higher peak loads. Again, our confidence that the hypertrophy stimulus is maximized, not quite there, but that's a sacrifice we're willing to make when the priority is more so on strength. I'll pause there because that was a lot and see what you guys have to say. We could get into the specifics of like, okay, what does the actual protocol look like in like a week to week progression thing? We can talk about that, but again, I'll pause there.
No, that was very comprehensive, Josh. Thank you. that was very clear, and I like the way you termed a lot of that. One thing me and Shane are constantly talking about is in what we refer to in our powerlifting club as the peak. It's an infamous peak destroyer of elbows sometimes. But one thing we
better now.
one thing we always say to each other is, like you said, there is maybe dropping off the RP of the accessories during those final kind of 6 weeks. We found a lot of benefits from it, because I suppose if we were to look at like you mentioned earlier, the residual effects of adaptations, like ultimately if muscle is put on somewhere, you've been fighting to get those adaptations realistically in 6 weeks. Once volume is kind of relatively still maintained, like dropping the RP for those accessories is not going to see any negatives at all. And I suppose when we are trying to maximize readiness, maximize the intent in those kind of heavier sets as we get into that kind of peaking phase, I think pulling back in the accessories, at least from an RP and effort perspective, I think is good. And even cognitively, I think when you're going into a session, you're like, oh fuck it, these accessories are going to beat the shit out of me now as well. It's nice to not have that.
That's huge.
Yeah. So I suppose, like you were saying, there's a week-to-week progression scheme there, maybe, that we can go through if you want to talk us through that.
Just to add on to that a little bit, I think the last thing I'll say on that before we head to the progression scheme thing is one thing recently that I think we've also kind of realized that modifies this relationship. Oh, okay, I remember my second thing now. Sorry. The other thing I think it starts to modify this relationship a little bit is when we're talking about accessory movements, is kind of where the exercise is most challenging in its range of motion. That's just, so if we kind of view this from a conceptual basis of like, okay, the entire point of this is to try to mitigate unnecessary fatigue so that we can perform, very well on our high load sets and ideally train with higher loads and tolerate that. It also seems to be the case that exercises that are more challenging in a shortened position or that part of its range of motion seem to be able to tolerate slightly higher RPs as well. So if you just think about this conceptually, like a step up, like a dumbbell step up, where you're really, really at end ranges of motion of the quadriceps versus a leg extension that's most challenging at all the way at the top. Generally, performing higher RP sets on the leg extensions, it creates less workout to workout fatigue than the step up. Step ups probably leave you really sore. Sometimes that can impact your performance for longer. So the point there is just another one of those variables. Generally, load. The higher we go in load, the more we'll kind of pull back on the RP. Also, I think the range of motion that's most challenging of the exercise also modifies that a little bit. So the exercises that are a little bit more challenging in the shortened position, you can probably keep the RPs up more towards the 7 range. Like leg extensions, I find for people just to keep some volume in, and you can keep those a little bit higher without much issue. Whereas like belt squats, hack squats, high bar squats, that kind of stuff that's more challenging. Also systemically, maybe because of the absolute loading, but the most difficult part of those range of motion is a little bit at a longer muscle length, probably a little bit more fatiguing. So that's one factor to consider. And the other thing I was going to say is the way that we configure the protocols with the hypertrophy work, pulling back on the RP a little bit. That's why it's crucial that you really hammer the hypertrophy exercises in the hypertrophy phase to make sure your RP accuracy is adequate, because in order to kind of get a similar stimulus at those lower RPs, we're of the opinion it kind of needs to be of a sufficient loading range. So generally speaking, somewhere 10 to 12 RM and heavier, that's where you can kind of get away with lower RPs and see similar hypertrophy outcomes. But if you're, like Josh said, doing those sets at 8 to 10, you're calling it a 1 to 2 RER when in reality it's 5 to 6. And then we, decrease the repetition range and we pull back the RP back to 6 to 7. Now we're, 7, 8 reps in reserve. That's probably now we're just pissing away time at that point. And that keeping that volume around probably isn't worth the squeeze anymore. So that's the two things I wanted to hit on that. But in terms of progression schemes, so I think this is definitely where the art of coaching rather than the science comes in my opinion. Like, even in just modern powerlifting coaching, you have some very, very different approaches that are all successful. You have RTS's emerging strategy approach, where essentially they're trying to keep as many things stagnant as possible. And that's where the difference between progression and progression scheme really shines, because they essentially have no progression scheme, but they still see progression within a block because the protocols are stagnant. Whereas some other people, which I would include ourselves in, favor a little bit more of an intentional progression scheme week to week with the protocols. I think the thing that aligns all of this personally is you are essentially trying to manipulate the lifter's psychology to get positive expectations rolling. That's ultimately the thing that separates all this to me, is whatever is going to allow the individual to feel confident week to week, adding load to the bar, which again, sport of powerlifting, that's ultimately what we're trying to do, and manipulating the protocols or lack thereof in order to increase the positive expectations week to week to really get that ball rolling, and their confidence is building week after week. So they come into those top set exposures with the high loads, not only with good performance, because we're manipulating everything, that proper fatigue management, but also as far as a mindset perspective, they have ready to have a killer performance and continuously do that week after week. I think this is where, personality type may come into things. People that are a little bit more reserved maybe don't have to have this kind of manipulation of the progression scheme, because they're more likely to really hit the RP every week, and keeping the protocol the exact same may be totally fine for them. Whereas people that are a little bit more eager to jump the gun, maybe we have to vary intentionally make it so that they're linearly stair stepping until they get to those highest load exposures. So I think, to me, when it comes to progression scheme, that's really what it comes down to. I think anecdotally, from our starting point, most of the time we're going to have some sort of kind of linear increase in those top sets. So maybe we go from a triple at a 5 to 6 RP to a triple to a 7 to 8 RP. Then we go a double to 7 to 8 RP. And then finally, maybe a single at a 7 to 8 RP. And so you're kind of increasing load. We just call that artificial progression. So even if you're not actually making progression with a stable protocol, you're still able to add weight to the bar week to week, which, again, if we're thinking about manipulating this to fuel positive expectations, that's probably going to be a pretty good bet. And for advanced lifters who, we can't totally expect them to actually add linear weight to the bar. Like if you're doing like a novice linear progression where you're doing 3 sets of 5 every session and you're just adding weight each session, advanced lifters, we're probably not going to be able to expect that. So actually manipulating the protocols in order to them to kind of get that effect usually can fuel some positive expectations. We hit a taper, we go to a meet, and usually good things happen because we've kind of had that slow, gradual increase in load over the course of the training cycle. So I think that's generally our starting point. But again, I think it really just comes down to psychology for the most part. And I don't think there's a right or wrong answer. It's just about finding the individual. What do they respond well to psychologically to really fuel those high load exposures week after week?
Really quick, just to jump in here, because I have a feeling some people are going to be like, well, if you're doing this artificial progression thing where like, okay, they're adding weight to the bar, but it's kind of artificial. It's because, maybe the reps are going down week to week or the RP is going up week to week. How can you tell if the block is working? I think three things come to mind. The first is you can look at estimated 1 rep maxes, right? So you can say, okay, I'm adding weight to the bar, but is that also coinciding with an increase in estimated 1 rep max? That's one thing you can look at. The second thing is I think you often just know, especially if you have an experienced trainee, you kind of know whether things are trending in a positive direction. So just by talking to the athlete. And then lastly, and most importantly, this is where block to block or cycle to cycle comparisons are absolutely massive. So in other words, like one athlete for some reason comes to mind for me right now that I work with is like, we kind of right now our training cycle that we've found a lot of success with and kind of what we're, refining cycle to cycle, but we're keeping a similar structure is 3-4 week waves, making up one training cycle. In the 4th week of each of those waves, we hit a triple at 9 on all 3 lifts. In the first block, double at 9 in week 8. So the end of the second wave at all 3 lifts, and then single at 9 on all 3 lifts in week 12. So the last week of the 3rd wave. And I can just look back. Okay, what did we hit 12 weeks ago? What did we hit 12 weeks ago? What did we hit 12 weeks ago? And we can see, okay, overall, are things trending in a positive direction? So again, I think almost on a week-to-week basis, I don't want to say progression is arbitrary, but it's definitely not required, right? Zach mentioned reactive training systems. They like the protocols are stagnant and load increases or decreases if it's a down performance, but overall will go up over the course of a block. And obviously, like that's a totally fine way to go about it. And we choose to make some changes week to week, whether that's increasing the RPE or increasing the percentage by 2.5%. But honestly, it's largely just psychological considerations, and it's not like required by any means.
Yeah, you said a lot of things that I really like. I suppose just the way you put them out, but the idea of the artificial progression, I suppose it's one thing that anybody that's ever done a powerlifting peak, you'll obviously start it off, I suppose, in some way with an easy single, and that'll progress almost linearly throughout a peak anyway, I suppose. And it's something that I suppose even most people without them realizing it, they are using RP at least, and they're using low RPs, like if you, regardless of what kind of a training system you follow, I suppose, outside of your following your OG Westside Barbell, where you're going in max, doing your daily max, but that kind of artificial progression scheme where you're starting off at quite a low, maybe even your singles are starting off as a last warm up. and then you're kind of maybe you're week out, 2 weeks out, you're hitting your last kind of RP9 single. But I think for us anyway, Shane, that's been a fairly effective way of starting off a peak and kind of progressing linearly throughout. And then, as you were saying, then within waves, that's one thing I would definitely use with clients is like when we have I would split the larger training cycle into waves, and like I was saying, there'd be planned deloads within, and I suppose the first week of that wave can almost act like a planned deload for load, and I suppose not exactly the traditional thing of deloading where you strip away volume and you strip away intensity. It's just that the volume will undulate slightly, or the load will undulate slightly, but overall, if we were to look at that over the macro lens of the training cycle, we might see volume slowly eke up and down. But no, I really like the way you put all of that. And then the final thing I suppose I wanted to say was for powerlifters, and I suppose everyone's kind of fallen into that psychological rut of shit, I haven't PB'd here now for 12 weeks, and it's a sport that as a psychological construct we don't really talk a lot about, but that kind of self-efficacy thing of just feeling confident about your lifts and feeling like, okay, there's a little bit of momentum here, and as you said, like that can't be underestimated at all. And I think how the lifter feels about their training really has to be considered, and not to take away, I suppose, from there has to be some resilience there in the lifter, and I suppose they can't be overall tying their worth and their identity maybe to their lifts, but I think there is definitely some value in them feeling that there's positive momentum going in their favor. And if it is the case that, look, we're gonna have these artificial progressions and you're gonna finish off the block with a nice little spicy RP9 treble, and look, maybe at the end of the 12 weeks we might have put on 2.5 kilos onto it, but you know what, you're going to feel good about it. That I think for in a lot of cases, especially with the more advanced lifters, like you were saying, where after 5 or 6 years of lifting, if you told me I'd put 2.5 kilos on my treble, I'd probably bite the hand off you for it. So no, a lot of the stuff is
yeah, man. I we cannot agree more. I can tell Zach's nodding his head as well. Like, I think the goal when I'm working with an athlete is like, all right, how do I get them into that positive feedback loop where things just start to really roll, right? Quick plug for our most recent podcast episode. I think it was like episode 26. We had a segment where we just talked about this a little bit about training momentum. Like, if you can artificially get them into that like flywheel where they start to get excited about training and they start to feel good, right? Even if it's artificial in nature, that can lead to like true progress, if you will, right? So just finding a way to increase confidence. I feel like when I'm writing programs, that's like half of what I'm thinking is like, how are they gonna view this psychologically? How is this gonna feel week to week? At what point do I want them to start to really get excited? What are they looking forward to? I actually ran into this with an athlete recently, as like, because I was revealing training weekly, and it was like I was giving velocity constraints on their top sets, right? And they're getting a little frustrated, like, why aren't you like letting me loose? And I'm like, oh, I'm letting you loose next week, but like I hadn't revealed that week of training or like finalized it. So like that was a good reminder for me. Make sure they have something to look forward to. Make sure they know it's kind of coming at the end of the block, for example, for them to stay diligent. Hey, we're holding you back. We're using a velocity constraint very strategically right here so that you feel really good day 2 of next week when you can push really hard, right? So those are just those little, like Zach said, the art that is never going to come from the research that I think all of us can just, really agree on.
Yeah, the biggest thing I've thought about too recently, that I think this is another thing that goes right in hand with that, is I would be curious to get your guys' take as well. If I look back and think about the athletes that have been the most successful, especially long term, it is the ones that have had I don't need to change things unnecessarily almost. And a lot of times that comes from motivation and enjoyment. And obviously that's abundantly important. Like we all agree with that. If you don't enjoy your training, it doesn't even matter. Everything else, it doesn't matter. But okay, that's important. But let's take a step back. How within a very systematic process can we create enjoyable training that people can be highly motivated? And to me, that's where all this artificial progression stuff comes in. If I feel 75% of the training cycle that I'm making these small incremental gains, then as a coach, I can have the advantage of not having to make changes more than I need to, so that I can view things. Here's training cycle 1. How did it go? Here's training cycle 2 with 2 changes throughout the entire 12 weeks. Let's do it again. Training cycle 3 with 2 more, you know what I mean? And like you can actually do this long-term individualization process. And to me, that's like the biggest thing with coaching is like, okay, we know theoretically we want to treat training like the scientific method, but when life gets in the way, we never can. So how do we get in the middle to make sure we can come as close to that end as possible to make these slow systematic adjustments? And to me, for people whose entire sport is dictated on adding weight to the bar, man, let's set up the training cycle so they can at least feel like they're doing that. Even if it is this artificial constraint, let's do that for the majority of the cycle so they at least are feeling related to their sport. They feel like a powerlifter, they're adding weight to the bar, and they're slowly progressing load over time. And then we're able to have that systematic process of comparing cycle to cycle and making those changes block to block, however you want to do it. But having that, marriage between, hey, I have to have this systematic process of tweaking things over time. But the reality is life gets in the way. We got to keep these lifters motivated and enjoying training. That's probably a good place to try to tie those things together.
100%. One thing I found fairly beneficial now, I suppose it's kind of a bit, I don't know, a bit uncommon to do, but one thing I really like doing, I suppose, particularly if a lifter is in off season, I'm kind of asking them, I'm like, what variations do you like? What don't you like? Like there's a group, I suppose, 2 or 3 lads that would train together that I was coaching, and any kind of a double pause variation or any kind of tempo work, I was getting videos and they were just dog shit, and I couldn't figure out, because they were really competent and they really liked their training, but like you were looking at it and they were just sloppy, and it got to the 3rd or 4th week and I was kind of talking to them, and it was just down to the simple thing of them not enjoying the exercise, despite them knowing, look, there's some efficacy here to its inclusion. But I think kind of a very basic thing of kind of having a collaborative process and making someone's training enjoyable to the degree that you can, I suppose, outside of them kind of saying, okay, I want to max out every 3 or 4 weeks, and giving them a little bit of what they want and a lot of what they need.
Are you training my clients? Are you? Yeah, no, I'd agree with Lawrence there. Like, I generally after a block, I ask like the lifter, regardless of how the actual numbers went, like how they actually enjoyed the block, because getting like the actual person's feedback is so important, because as like training enjoyment is key. I mean, it doesn't matter if you're progressing, if you're not enjoying your training, like you're not going to do it. So yeah, I generally get them to give me a review of the block, and yes, similar to Lawrence, I'd usually get some complaints about double pauses, especially double pause deadlifts. I give out to my own coach about them, but like nevertheless, like you do have to kind of give people these things as well, just to see if they will enjoy it or if it will improve. Because I suppose, as you know, you're not always going to enjoy the exercises that are effective on your program either. So it's not always a case of just doing the exercises that you like. Sometimes, as Lauren said, you have to give them what they need and what they want at the same time. But yeah, I suppose to kind of answer your question, it would just be being really keen on that client feedback. And I suppose that's one thing that they're pretty keen at RTS as well, is like, making it an individual process. It doesn't necessarily need to be an individual sets and reps that is going to work for this person, but just more so tailoring the program so the person's going to adhere to it, they're going to get results, and it's going to suit where they are at the moment in their life.
Yeah. I think the key here, and this could potentially be like a nice take home for the listener, is where can we be flexible in the training program? Because you mentioned, Shane, give them some of what they need and give them some of what they want, which I don't know if our advisor, Dr. Zordos, originated that, but it's definitely something, I didn't come up with. But when you think of it through that lens, is like, where can we be flexible with the training program, and where do we kind of have to be rigid in order to actually see these patterns emerge and see and be systematic with the changes, like Zac said. So yeah, switching from a hack squat to a leg press, you can probably make that change block to block or cycle to cycle. Generally speaking, the training stimulus is going to be similar most of the time. But, you know, going from super high volume to super low volume because of enjoyment or something like that, then you start to get a little bit shaky, right? It's like, all right, this is kind of a primary training variable that's actually going to drive the response. And this is something that I've been reflecting on personally recently, because we work with athletes in two capacities. So we work with athletes one-on-one, and then we also kind of have like a group-based kind of semi-automated, like cycle to cycle adjustments programming system, right? So in other words, we kind of set somebody up with like given volume levels for each of their lifts, given volume allocations between like main lifts and, kind of their accessory work, as well as like, their peak loading and how that'll progress throughout the training cycle. And then we have a way to systematically adjust that cycle to cycle. So the point is with one-on-one coaching, you have infinite flexibility, right? But with this, more group-based, semi-automated approach, you have certain constraints. And what I've found is I actually think that can be a blessing in disguise when you have those constraints, and being strategic with what you allow them to select, right, on their end, again, can be a blessing in disguise, because those constraints kind of force you to be systematic. Whereas, I'm kind of lean on the people pleaser side of things, right? If someone comes to me and their weekly reports indicate that motivation isn't like close to the highest possible that they can rate, I'm like, hey, what can we do? I want to make sure you're enjoying this. I want to make sure, you're happy. I want to make sure everything's going well. And you might kind of stray from that base structure that you really need to kind of maintain in order to actually do your job as a coach and systematically improve their training over time for them. Right. So it's a fine line, and being smart about where you give them some of what they want, and while also maintaining that structure and making sure you're systematic with things, I think is kind of like when you can land on that for a given athlete, I think that's when you're kind of off to the races with progress.
I think it's also important to kind of relay to the client as well that they don't need changes like as frequently as they may think they do, because I think that's, and as well, even as a coach, like trying to tell yourself that you're not there to make changes, you're there to help the person progress, because that's one thing that like you can kind of get a feeling as if you're not really doing anything sometimes, even if the person's moving in the direction that they want. But yeah, it's just kind of one thing to kind of take into consideration.
I actually really like what you said there. I think it was, you're not there to make changes, you're there to help them progress. I think I'm going to steal that, because I think you're totally right. You want to feel like you have your hands dirty, right? You want to feel like you're doing something that, you're providing value, right? But sometimes the best value, kind of paradoxically, is just doing less, right? And also on the lifter end, right? Sometimes the best value is not going in for an extra GPP session and doing 20 sets of upper back. It's actually inaction, right? And just chilling out. So I like the way you said that, Shane.
I don't speak often, but when I do, I hit it home.
Right on.
Anyway, grand. Lawrence, have you got any more questions that you want to ask the boys?
No, that's pretty much it. I actually think we covered a lot more than I.
Yeah.
That little bit on the end was very insightful. You're two guys whose opinion I think most people should take into account. In all things coaching, you definitely have a very well thought out perspective on, I suppose, coaching broadly, but also in powerlifting.
We'll get your money after the show.
Say that again.
We'll get you your money after the show.
No, lads, we really appreciate you coming on. We'd love to have you on again. Thanks so much for taking time out of your busy schedules for popping on and chatting to us.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you both so much. Had a great time.
I'll be taking notes tomorrow now while I'm editing this. So thank you very much for that. It was amazing. Now, obviously, it's plug time. So guys, tell people at home where they can find you, if it's not obvious. First
and foremost, just to echo what Zac said, huge thank you for having us on, guys. listened to a few of your guys' episodes with other guests and have really enjoyed it. So it's an honor to be on. In terms of finding us, probably the easiest place is just to go to Instagram. I'm josh.datadrivenstrength and Zach is zach.datadrivenstrength. Go to like Linktree in there and you can find all the stuff we offer, our podcast, all that good stuff.
Unbelievable. So yeah, thank you very much, Lance, for coming on. And thank you very much at home for listening. As usual, you can do what you do after you listen to a podcast. You can leave a rating. You can follow us on Spotify, share the page on Instagram, that kind of stuff. I'm very bad at round these things off, but look, it is what it is. Anyway, we will have another episode out next week as well. So yeah, we'll catch you then. Good luck. What is up, people? Thank you very much for listening to another episode of the podcast. Just a quick announcement, myself and Lawrence do have coaching spaces available. So if you're looking to get into powerlifting, if you're looking to become the strongest version of yourself, or achieve the lean physique that you've always been looking for, or even if it's just to improve your nutrition so you can help with your sports performance or gain some healthy habits, we are there to help. So if you want to get in contact with us, you can get in contact through our emails or our Instagram, which are in the description below, and we look forward to helping you achieve your goals.